President Trump will sit down with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the White House later today to talk tariffs, trade, and the U.S.-Canadian relationship.
I think there's a lot at stake on both sides. First of all, we have a brand new prime minister who was just elected, and I think his first real trip into the United States to sit down with Donald Trump to discuss
how comfortable Carney is at these events with other world leaders and dignitaries.
Well, the outcome is the tougher part of that question. I mean, I do think he's had a good outing on the world stage. He's incredibly comfortable. This setting of world leader fits him like a glove.
The most surprising was when the American ambassador to Canada attempted to gain favor by accusing Canadians of being ungrateful. And we're going to dive straight into the main points of our discussion today. All right. I'm sad that I traveled to Canada since it is really hard to locate Canadians who are enthusiastic about the relationship between the United States and Canada. He did not receive a calm reaction. The remark was not avoided by Prime Minister Mark Carney. He exposed the tension simmering south of the border by transforming it into a straightforward challenge. It is not on the table, but it is still feasible, not only for the benefit of the United States, but also for the benefit of the Canadian people. In actuality, the best trading relationships and agreements with the United States are between Canada and Mexico. His statements were a reminder that Canada is no longer willing to be viewed as a subordinate player in someone else's game, and they bore the weight of defiance. What transpired was a struggle for power, influence, and dignity rather than a diplomatic sparring match. Furthermore, the actual query is, did Washington undervalue the neighbor it believed it could dominate? When U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra started making public comments that sounded more like reprimands than like diplomacy, the friction between Washington and Ottawa became the main focus. He bemoaned what he perceived as Canada's lack of passion for its relationship with the United States twice in 1 week. Speaking of aspirations that extended into steel, vital minerals, electricity, and nuclear cooperation, he asserted that Washington had hoped for much more than the renegotiated Kuzma Accord. However, in his narrative, such aspirations were abandoned, unmet since America's appetite was greater than Canada's. It was a deliberate effort to portray Canada as narrow-minded, unprepared to take the initiative, and unenthusiastic about the cooperation. The ambassador continued after that. He went farther, expressing dissatisfaction with the Canadian people as a whole, as well as with the leaders in Ottawa. He claimed that while the business community remained enthusiastic, the general Canadian public was uninterested in the U.S. It was a remarkable statement implying that a neighbor with whom one had been in alliance and commerce for more than a century had somehow turned cold and ungrateful. However, his statements were more laden with the annoyance of a nation witnessing its influence eroding than with the weight of reality. Hoekstra neglected to reveal the true reason for the cooling. Canadians did not suddenly lose sight of the significance of their shared history or the cross-border trade. It was that years of animosity under Donald Trump's leadership had damaged confidence. Canadian industries had been severely impacted by steel and aluminum tariffs. The Prime Minister of Canada had been openly mocked and fired as a governor. Long regarded as unbreakable, the relationship was strained by insults, trade disputes, and disrespect for national sovereignty. Canadians were cautious, not ungrateful in such setting. People stopped crossing the bridges that Washington had destroyed, and it was shocked. Prime Minister Mark Carney had a scathing but measured response when asked to address the ambassador's comments. He didn't thrash or show emotion. Rather, he clarified 3 points. First, the big deal is not on the table at the moment, as Hoekstra mentioned. Second, Canada already has one of the most robust trade agreements with the U.S. and Mexico, which serves as a reasonable and useful foundation. Thirdly, the connection will only be expanded if it is in line with Canadian interests. That was the main takeaway. Canada will not enter into accords at its own expense to further Washington's objectives. Because Carney's response went beyond a simple reply, it struck a chord. It was a principled statement. He clarified that an agreement must benefit both parties. Blockagism is not what that is. It's sovereignty. The true test of leadership in trade and diplomacy is not the number of deals struck, but rather whether those agreements safeguard the country's industries, labor force, and long-term stability. It was precisely because his delivery was non-defensive that it conveyed strength. Canada has leverage, and leverage shifts the balance of power. He reminded both Canadians and Americans. In diplomacy, tone is important. Washington frequently benefits by inciting confrontation, applying increasing pressure, and requiring responses. Trump and his emissaries were masters at inciting conflict to agitate their peers. Carney, however, did not grant them such a triumph. His words were purposeful, his tone calm, and his stance unwavering. Because it unnerves those who anticipate dominating by turmoil, that stillness has power of its own. Ottawa established its own conditions rather than being forced into Washington's game. At home, the assurance was equally crucial. Canadians recalled starkly how America's unpredictable actions exposed people and industries, and how tariffs jeopardized their lives. Carney's statement marked a clear departure from that weakness. He assured Canadians that their government would not submit to such intimidation in the future. Those times are gone. Because sovereignty is not an abstract concept, that message is important. Payrolls, industries, and community safety are all impacted nationwide. However, his response was not a bang of the door. Carney made space by stating that a bigger agreement was not yet on the table. Upcoming discussion. That wording was intentional. Leverage was maintained. Canada is not desperate, it informed Washington. You must bring terms that respect equality if you want more. In other words, power rather than submission is the starting point. Canada has a working framework already. The U.S. must earn more if it desires it. Hoekstra's complaint sounded flimsy because of this. The ambassador sounded annoyed, but Carney sounded assured. One neighbor reprimanded another for not being enthusiastic. The other spoke in a leader's voice, outlining priorities and boundaries. That distinction was very important to Canadians. It signified that their leadership was refusing to let Washington control the discussion. Rather, Ottawa was addressing its people directly, emphasizing that their needs come first. There was no mistaking the symbolism. Some in Washington have long considered Canada to be the junior partner, demonstrated that it was no longer open to being cornered or lectured. No new agreements could be made unless there was reciprocal respect. That position bolstered confidence in leadership for Canadians who had endured years of uncertainty. Carney had no problem saying no. The strongest stance in diplomacy is frequently to say no with assurance. The broader plan that underlies his remarks illustrates Canada's current positioning. The nation has pursued prospects in Asia, strengthened its links with Europe, and expanded trade with Mexico. It has simultaneously made investments in essential minerals, agricultural capacity, energy resiliency, and domestic strength. These actions provide genuine options and lessen dependency on Washington. And a nation gets power when it has options. Washington is having trouble with that. Canada is free to leave without fear. The United States might keep pushing. It might keep asking for more from its neighbor to the north. However, this episode's lesson is that outdated strategies are no longer effective. Canada has evolved. Its leadership is more willing to say no, its economy is more resilient, and its ties are wider. Washington's strategy of dominance and coercion has mostly lost its impact. Therefore, Hoekstra was not displaying Canadian weakness when he expressed disappointment. He was exposing the frustration of Americans. The U.S. wants its neighbor to be fervent, respectful, and successful. Instead, it is receiving self-confidence and defiance. The irony is that Canada's lack of enthusiasm is not the reason for America's disappointment. It is regarding Canada's refusal to fulfill Washington's expectations. And for that reason, Mark Carney's position is important. He made it plain that Canada will not accept unfair treatment, that it will defend its industry and workers, and that it will only sign deals that benefit its citizens. Instead of exposing American desperation, Hoekstra believed it would be a pressure technique. In comparison, Canada appears stable, self-assured, and steadfast in its sovereignty. This conflict is about more than just commerce. It concerns respect, dignity, and Canada's global position. Everyone watching could see the line thanks to Mark Carney. This was not a response to Hoekstra because of this. It was a direct message to Trump. Canada is no longer being bullied. In addition, Donald Trump's most recent statement has sparked one of the most intense arguments in U.S.-Canada ties in history. He presented Canada's rivers as unexplored resources that were just waiting to be discovered while he was in Washington. He suggested a remedy that might stabilize crops and communities throughout the American West and save areas suffering from drought. The Columbia River, which runs more than 2,000 kilometers from British Columbia into the Pacific Northwest, was his main concern. The timing of his remarks was what made them explosive. They coincided with talks to update the 1961 Columbia River Treaty, a long-standing pact that balanced the advantages of hydroelectric power with flood control. Trump quickly changed the focus from collaboration to conflict, transforming shared waterways into negotiating leverage and indicating that domestic survival would suddenly be sufficient justification for crossing the border for Canada's lifelines. The response in Ottawa was quick and ruthless. Environmental organizations, advocacy groups, and Indigenous countries banded together to protest, stating that giving up management of rivers would have far-reaching effects. Trump's proposal was portrayed as a direct attack on sovereignty by more than 80 groups. An unexpectedly harsh response was given by Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had established his name on financial leadership rather than vehement speech. He proclaimed that foreign countries would never be able to purchase or treat Canada's lakes and rivers as commodities. What he said was cut, decisive, and unambiguous. Routine conversations quickly turned into a global standoff, which was seen with increasing anxiety throughout North America and beyond. The consequences of Canada's rejection became evident to the United States quite rapidly. States in the West that had relied on new water supplies to ensure harvests and sustain communities were suddenly confronted with the same persistent drought. The hardest-hit states were Arizona, Nevada, and California. Instead of expecting new flows from the north, farmers in the Central Valley, the center of America's fruit and vegetable production, gazed out over dwindling reservoirs and empty canals. A sense of betrayal accompanied the promises that fell to dust. Because California doesn't fend for itself, that betrayal spread. The country is fed by it. Those fields produce 2/3 of America's fruits and nuts and nearly 40% of its veggies. Yields decreased in the absence of water. The cost of groceries increased. Food prices increased more, further taxing those already burdened by inflation. While shortages of basic foods like almonds, lettuce, and what started as a political message in Washington had now made its way to the dinner tables of regular households as tomatoes started to reverberate across global supply lines, establishing a clear connection between high-level diplomacy and daily life. The first to suffer, but by no means the last, was agriculture. In addition to saving farms, Trump had referred to Canadian water as a source of energy for business and technology. Those assurances had been taken seriously by businesses. Relief was promised to semiconductor manufacturers in Arizona that use tens of millions of gallons of water every week. Hydro-dependent energy companies, manufacturers, and resource-intensive establishments in the Pacific Northwest and Midwest expected comparable assistance. Those expectations were dashed by Canada's rejection. Supply chains prepared for shortages that would impact electronics, cars, and even defense equipment if production slowed and shifts were reduced. The optics were bad for politics. Trump had promised to stop depending on others and had positioned himself as strong and independent. However, Washington was left vulnerable because Canada, a smaller neighbor, had flatly rejected. According to him, even the Great Lakes millions more were shaken by the possibility of sacrificing the water quality accord. Cities that rely on the lakes for drinking water, such as Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, were suddenly confronted with the prospect that long-standing protections might be lifted in a moment of political wrangling. Almost immediately, the belief that international agreements were impregnable vanished. An important source of American confidence has vanished along with the long-held belief that access to Canadian water was safe. For more, hit like and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening.